Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. With all the travel I've been having over the last couple of weeks and the excitement of the NAIC, I haven't yet done a first impressions video of Night Wanderer, which is now legal out in Japan and is going to be our Shrouded Fabel expansion for the World Championship. So definitely worth keeping an eye on these cards because these are going to be the main sort of tweaks that we get for that World Championships based on, adapting the NAIC meta, which was pretty funky. So we are on PokemonProxies.com, the website that Jack runs, with all these amazing proxies that you can download right now if you want to start getting some in-paper practice in from the new set. We're, of course, going to start with the trainer cards, and we have 3 A-specs in the set. 2 of them are item cards. The first is Dangerous Laser. Your opponent's active Pokemon is now burned and confused. It's really not worth an A-spec slot, to be honest with you. We don't have that great item recycle. Even if we could theoretically use this card every single turn, it's still not all that powerful. So, yeah, I don't think this is worth your A-spec slot right now. You also have the Poker Vital A item card, which heals 150 from one of your Pokemon. If the card is in your discard pile, it can't be put back into your deck or hand. So it is a one-time use heal of 150. Comparing this to like a Scoop Up Cyclone, which can be recycled, I think Cyclone is typically just better anyway, but there might be very niche situations where you have a Pokemon that has too much on it to be worth like trying to pick up and put back down into play if its attack cost is too large, or if there's other factors there with the Pokemon that you don't want to really spam it up and down with a Cyclone or a Churro or anything like that, where you just have that instant heal and it's like good enough. But I think that's very niche, and again, competing with such powerful A-spec cards now, I don't think it cuts it. I'm also just going to jump down to the other A-spec card, which I think is the most interesting one of the bunch, actually. It's a stadium card, which is called Neutral Center, preventing all damage done to Pokemon that don't have rule boxes by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon EX and Pokemon V. If the card is in your discard pile, it can't be put into your deck or hand. So again, you don't have that same recycle option. It's going to be a one-and-done situation. I think the most interesting application for this card is actually going to be alongside Great Tusk. I know Great Tusk hasn't been that great of an archetype as of late, but it definitely feels like a card where even if your opponent has a number of stadium cards or even Lost Vacuum, you can mill them, and then later on in the game, all of your essentially 200 hit point Great Tusk with those Ancient Boost Energy Capsules can no longer be damaged by EX and V. I think it could give that deck so much time to just get over the line with those discards. So I actually think it could be low-key very good for a Great Tusk archetype. You could also think about this in Control, but obviously they already have Mimikyu and hit point buff anyway, and it feels like Hero's Cape is more important, and possibly even Secret Box, which we did see in the Senior Division for the NAIC second place list of Snorlax are doing better. So definitely a powerful card, but it feels like best in a mill archetype like Tusk, where it previously would play Mimikyu, but you're not getting the active mill from Mimikyu. You're just hoping that a draw from the top deck is like slowing them down. But in this case, you can see what's gone. If they have lost too many stadium cards and vacuums, then this can just be like a checkmate situation card. So seems actually very, very dangerous for Great Tusk. I don't know if it pole vaults it into like a very high tier deck, but it definitely seems much more dangerous as a milling archetype now that you can literally stonewall the opponent from taking prizes against you, like for the late game in certain instances. And basically just means that there's more discards that can go haywire with your Great Tusk to turn into a win con, whereas sometimes you were just looking for switch outs and that sort of thing to make your counter catches better. Now if you hit enough stadium cards, then you have a checkmate in that scenario as well. Let's move on to the other item cards. We have Nightly Stretcher. You can put a Pokemon or a basic energy card from your discard pile into your hand. So this is an upgrade of Pokemon Rescue from back in the day, because we have the extra flexibility of getting a basic energy card back into our hand. We already have a lot of search and recovery for basic energy, so I don't know just how incredible this is, but as we do know from like the Rescue Stretcher days, immediate access to a Pokemon from an item card is still just like quite good. So I think this is going to be sometimes, dropping down to one rod and having one Nightly Stretcher as that kind of split, so you can have that immediate access to Pokemon could be quite valuable. So yeah, I think this is a handy item card. I don't think it has that power level of being like immediately into lots of deck lists, but that little splash of versatility makes it a little bit better of a card than Pokemon Rescue, which did make it into some decks at times as well. We have the Binding Mochi, which is going to be a very relevant damage mod tool, to be honest with you. The attacks of the poison Pokemon this card is attached to deal 40 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. Now there are a few ways to actually poison our own Pokemon in the format. There's the Petulant EX that we'll look at in a moment. There's Janine's Secret Technique, a supporter card, which also poisons you, but has actually good effects. And there's also Brute Bonnet alongside Ancient Booster Energy Capsule. The ability can poison both active Pokemon as well. So there are a lot of ways to actually enable this poison, and a 40 damage mod is actually pretty relevant, to be honest with you, especially if we are using Brute Bonnet to also poison the opponent's active. It's actually like a 50 damage mod from the help of this tool and a few other things. So you need to combine this in an archetype that already has that poison synergy, but it feels like it could be a package that could easily go into a number of archetypes. The Janine and the Petulant specifically work in terms of synergies with a Darkness Pokemon. So straight away I'm thinking it could be a mod for Charizard EX. We've seen that Kieran has been in the list before. We've certainly seen things like Defiance Band and even Vitality Band as just that 10 damage. Now it's 40 damage buff. That's a big deal for speeding up Charizard EX's damage output. Could also be really good with Clorf. I think Clorf Brute Bonnet is already a combo we've seen in the past, and now pushing that Clorf's Unhinged Scissors by 40 more damage is also very, very dangerous. Even things like Gouging Fire EX, which is already an ancient Pokemon, so the ancient card package of having Brute Bonnet in the list isn't that far-fetched, and you can push that 260 up to 300, and if you're Brute Bonneting, that's actually 310 with that damage tick of poison as well, so you actually are able to knock out things like Gardevoir EX, which previously was a little bit tricky for Gouging Fire. So I think the Binding Mochi is going to allow a number of poison packages to make their way into deck lists. It still feels a little bit clunky because you have to find this tool at the right time whilst also having the prep of Petulant or Janine. Those seem like the easiest ones to do, but also the sort of more universal outside of the dark archetypes is the Brute Bonnet plus another tool. But we have great tool search in Arven and Town Store, so maybe it's not all that irrelevant. Maybe it's quite easy to get working. It's something I need to definitely experiment with a lot more. It's also obviously worth noting that it's going to push the Okidogi EX. That's kind of the attacking archetype they're trying to push in this set, and it does seem to have great synergy there. The other tool from the set is the Power Hourglass. At the end of your turn, if the Pokemon this card is attached to is in the active spot, you can attach one basic energy from your discard pile to that Pokemon. This is definitely one of the weakest forms of energy acceleration that we see. It's retroactive. You can't immediately like ramp an energy and then use it straight away to reach some attacks a little bit quicker. So I think its main synergy really is for attacks that discard energy. The main ones that come to my mind is the likes of Greninja EX, which isn't seeing too much play either, and maybe even like the Luxray EX, the stage 2 that we have that has a secondary attack, not the item locking one, that does 250 and discards 2 lightning. These just don't really seem all that worthwhile because it is just so slow to get this online, and if you have like high energy attack cost, it feels like this is way too slow. You have to wait, sit in the active, get hit, then get like 1 proc of acceleration. If you've already been hit, you're very rarely getting the Hourglass to proc twice, so I think generally this is quite weak overall. I don't think it's going to see too much play. Then we have some interesting supporter cards. We have Colress's Tenacity, and we do have to bear in mind there is a Kieran from the set which will punish the use of this supporter card, so bear in mind if ever you are adding a Colress's Tenacity to your deck list, you have to also probably play a Manaphy in the list as well, just in case your opponent is taking a Kieran for the World Championships. But you search your deck for a Stadium and an Energy card, reveal them, put them into your hand. I think the design of the supporter card is really cool. Of course, we can get special energy, so the ones that jump out to me would be the likes of Double Turbo Energy to help with like a Clorf Brute Bonnet deck, which I've already mentioned with Binding Mochi, so bear that in mind. Also, cards like Luminous and Legacy Energy seem to have great synergy here as well. Obviously, Legacy is a busted A-spec card, and now we have even more tutor for it. Not just the Lugia archetypes can cherry pick this for the right time, which does seem very promising, but also like a thin count of Gift Energy, if your deck can afford to play it, means that we can now also cherry pick that card for the right time and swing it onto the board to sort of give ourselves that Iron of Protection in certain instances. So the special energy are busted in the format, and that's kind of the main selling point of the supporter card, but don't write off how good finding a Stadium is either, because similar to Arven, Stadium can get Town Store, which then gets us a tool, and as we know with Arven, the tool selection is also busted right now. There's a lot of damage mods, there's a lot of hit point buffs, there's obviously Forest Seal Stone as well, so Colress can be a really weird backdoor to Town Store to V-Star power with Forest Seal Stone to then get any card. So similar to an Arven, the Colress can then be a comp search in a very backward way. Also just getting early game Artisan can be powerful. Getting some tech Stadium cards like Collapse Stadium or Temple of Sinnoh also has benefits. this. So I think this card is actually way more flexible than I first gave it credit for. I'm already trying to work this into a couple archetypes. I could definitely see something like Pidgeot, Dragapult looking to play this supporter card to give you extra access to Neo upper energy. And I think ultimately it kind of just unlocks doors for attacking options. I also think this is really possibly quite good for a Terapagos EX deck, which is further down the line. But yeah, I think this chorus actually has a lot of situational uses, even if it is going to be that low count in lists. We then have Janine's Secret Technique. You choose up to 2 of your Darkness Pokemon. For each of those Pokemon, search your deck for a basic Darkness and attach it to that Pokemon, then shuffle your deck. If you attach an energy to your active Pokemon in this way, that Pokemon is now poisoned. And we know that poison is actually an upside because we have the Binding Mochi as well. So if you want to have that combo, it certainly is available to us. The Janine's Secret Technique is actually just like a Lesser Sparkle, but rather than being limited to just 4 copies of your special energy, you can have as many Darkness energy as you want in the deck. And we have cards like Super Rod that can obviously reload those Darkness energy back into the deck. So Janine is much more live throughout the entire game. It's still not a draw supporter, which is kind of my main issue with this sort of card if we are going to use it as a dark energy acceleration option. Comparing it to Asada, where we can get 3 cards on Roaring Moon, that's a lot to ask for. So my main issue with a Janine like Okie Dokie deck, which is kind of what they're trying to give us here with the crazy chain attack being pretty good when you are self-poisoned, right? You do 260 for 3 darkness. We already have Dark Patch and we already have Sada, which could be being done on Roaring Moon, which can already knock out everything and draw more cards at the same time. So I actually think this card is low-key a little bit of bait. I also think the Okie Dokie deck in general is kind of a bait to me. I think the Petron is very, very good and could just be imported into other stuff, but I'm not that impressed by Janine's Secret Technique, even though it is a busted Lesser Sparkle. I feel like we already have Raging Bolt Ogerpon, which is probably a more consistent build of the Okie Dokie deck, and you even have more hit points because so often you're poisoning yourself with Okie Dokie. And I also think that it could just be worse than Roaring Moon that we currently have in format and also isn't doing all that much right now. Does that make sense? So yeah, I'm actually not super impressed by this supporter, even though it looks very glamorous and has amazing synergy with some of the stuff we have in format. I'm not convinced that this just like pure attacking dark basic deck is better than Raging Bolt or just stealing that Petron and adding it to Roaring Moon EX. We then have Cassiopeia. You can only use this card when it is the last card in your hand. Search your deck for 2 cards, put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. Yeah, not worth it. It's not worth building around this effect where you constantly bin down to 0 because this is just not live in so many situations where the hand doesn't map out quite properly. So yeah, this is overall just absolutely terrible. For what it's worth, you can do some funky stuff with the new Nighttime Academy Stadium, which I'm getting to in a moment alongside Squovit. You could Squovit into Cassiopeia, then use Cassiopeia, then like bib up your hand again. So there is some wonky stuff you can try and do with this card, and we do have the synergies in formats, but I still don't think there's a big selling point here. Now that I've mentioned it, I may as well talk about the Nighttime Academy Stadium card. Once during each player's turn, that player may put a card from their hand to the top of their deck. So it's like half an Oranguru that we used to have. So there are still those same synergies where you're protecting yourself around your own Professor's Research or other annoying discards. You're protecting yourself around Iono as well by banking other cards to the top of your deck rather than in your hand, so that if you do get hit with Iono, you draw straight into those cards. And we actually have a decent number of acceleration options which do interact with the top of your deck. There's Kiram VMAX, there's obviously Electric Generator, and there's even Metang, so there are a few ways we can try and synergize with a Stadium. I still think it's just too low impact of a Stadium to be worthwhile right now. So I don't think it's going to really make it too well into archetypes, to be honest with you. And then the last training we have is the Zerosic Scheme. Your opponent discards cards from the hand until they have 3 remaining in the hand. So we do already have the hand trimmer in format, and generally we are really focused on having engine Pokemon in play throughout the entire game, just so that we're protected around Unfair Stamp and Iono at this point. So the same logic kind of applies here. Obviously, the scheme isn't a 2-sided effect like the trimmer would be, so you can have an expansive hand and still go for the Zerosic schemes. So possibly it lends itself a little bit more to controlling archetypes that are using Rotom throughout the entire game. And there are still some synergy cards in the format like Arbok EX and Luxray EX, but if you're still trying to play those archetypes without using draw supporters now, like good luck to you. I just don't think they've ever been that consistent. Because your opponent is basically in control of this effect, I still think it's not all that powerful compared to the other very disruptive Power Spike supporters which we currently have in the format. So quick note to Joltik, it is a grass type. This is the first grass Joltik we have, and there is GLC to think about here, where this Garvantula can actually do really good things in GLC, where the Shocking Web does 130 if it has a lightning attached, and then can deal 50 more if they have an ability. 180 is really good on this cheap threshold for potential Galvantula. There's also the double thread option of Galvantula from the Steam Siege expansion that is now opened up to the grass type. I will also be mentioning GLC and Cube just for what it's worth, and Galvantula typically is pretty interesting in Cube as well because they have a lot of spread effects. This is likely too powerful for Cube though because its damage output is pretty silly. but just something to bear in mind there. It's cool that we finally get a grass mon. We also have the Dartrix in the set, which is a new United Wings mon, which I suppose is kind of interesting. We can now max out at 320 damage if we use a Ditto, and we have all of our Wings mons in the bin. I don't think this is the issue for United Wings right now. Having to use so many low hit point Pokemon is very sketch. When there's Monkey Dory around alongside Fluttermane, there's also, of course, the Dragapult still in format, which is still super relevant. So, yeah, I think the low hit point United Wings deck is still going to be quite weak, even though it does boast a couple of still relevant type coverages. And even gaining grass type if you want to play like 1 or 2 Rowlet, but I don't think it's going to be worthwhile to add even more Pokemon to your deck list just to have coverage into Charizard, to be honest with you. Bulu could be good for grass GLC. It's a 2 energy 220 effectively if you have your Totem online, and obviously there's great acceleration. We have Kingdra EX, a stage 2 310 hit point, weak to lightning, which has King's Order. For 1 water you put 3 water Pokemon from your discard pile onto your bench. Yes, this can be stage 2 Pokemon and all that other good stuff. There really still aren't that many good targets, though. I think things like other Kingdra, Seadras, Blastoise, Baxcalibur, these are kind of the Pokemon you'd want to search out. And even then, you're foregoing any damage on turn 2 in the best case scenario. Obviously, because you're a water type, you can easily Irida this out, so it's quite a reliable turn 2 attack, but you're doing an attack for no damage output, which isn't all that relevant. And the Hydro Pump is a 50 plus 50 for each water attached to this Pokemon. It's just not as efficient as Chien-Pao, so yeah, I don't really see a reason to play this card. We then have a Terrastal Revavroom EX, a 280 hit point lightning type Pokemon with a metal attack cost. The accelerating flash for 1 metal does 20, and if this Pokemon moves from the bench to the active, it does 120 more damage. 140 for 1 is actually super efficient, and it's a lightning type, which is actually really relevant right now in the format, most notably dealing with Pidgeot EX, but also getting the bonus of being good into Lugia V-Star, which was actually the most played deck at the NAIC, and it also has random bonuses of dealing with things like Palkia V-Star, if that's going to be cropping up in Goldengo. As we know, Revavroom is also a pretty interesting evolution line, where we can also have the Rumbling Engine as our engine Pokemon within our own line, so we can have a decent onboard draw engine whilst also having a pretty efficient attacking option. By having such a cheap energy attack cost, we can even try and weave in cards like Luminous Energy in this deck list, and then have a smorgasbord of other type coverage attackers, even having things like Radzard as a late game swing option, maybe even the Blood Moon Ursaluna as well, or instead of. It's obviously very similar to Gliscopod GX, and that saw a lot of play, so the fact that we have the return of Gliscopod that has really relevant weakness, I think is actually massive. It does have a second attack in Speed Break for 3 metal, you deal 250, then you discard this Pokemon and all cards attached to it, so maybe you can do a huge hit, and then also throw a single prize Pokemon into the active, but I'm not really visioning any Revavroom decks having a lot of metal acceleration. Obviously there is Matang in the format, but if you're doing that, you're playing Dialga instead of this card, right? We then have a pretty interesting Dusknoir line. It is worth noting that we have a very cool Duskull in GLC as well, where we can instantly evolve up into our Dusclops. And as we know, Psychic in GLC does all sorts of damage counter placement, and even has some attacking Pokemon which wants to be on certain prize counts. Think about things like Blacephalon. So I do think this could be a really cool line to experiment with. We have Blood Moon Ursaluna. It's like a new version of the Galarian Zapdos that we used to have. It's a fighting type with 150 hit points, actually kind of bulky. It allows you to attach 2 basic fighting energy cards from your hand to this Pokemon upon benching it, and it has the Mad Mud Bite for fighting colorless. You deal 100 plus 30 more for each damage counter on your opponent's active Pokemon. It's a cool card. It does have powerful synergy alongside E-Switch and that stuff, but I don't think it's relevant from the get-go as like this sort of coming into play answer to Iron Hands as well, being like that universal fighting type you could splash in. It's also just like a lot of cards in a package, and you also need to prep damage stuff, so it doesn't seem all that powerful to me. It is worth noting though, if we can have a sort of like semi-spread style deck, there is the Lana's Assistance in formats, which can get the pieces for this Blood Moon pretty easily once we've prepped some damage across the opponent's board. We have a new Ancient Slitherwing. This is actually kind of an interesting card. It has 140 hit points, is a fighting type, and has the Iron Buster attack. For fighting colorless, we deal 20, plus if your opponent has a future Pokemon in play, 120 more damage. It's a very easy answer to Iron Hands that the Ancient Box decks now gain. It is another 3 retreat Pokemon, so it's really awkward to start out with it, but it looks like a much better version of the previous Slitherwing that we had, because it only requires 1 colorless in its attack cost for serving that purpose of responding into an Iron Hands. We have a new Crobat line. I'm celebrating because it could be really cool in Cube to have this, and I'm definitely going to try it out because I already have Crobat in my Cube. But we have the Shadow Envoy Crobat, 130 hit point Dart type with free retreat, and once during a turn, if you played a Janine's Secret Technique from your hand during this turn, you may draw cards until you have 8 in hand. This is obviously a very powerful draw option, and it might be one of the selling points of trying out a Janine-style deck, where we can have this Crobat as a single prize attacker just to get through Mimikyu, whilst also being a means of just topping up our hand. The issue with an ability like this is that if you are getting hit with Iono or Stamp and whatnot, it doesn't actually refill your hand because you're just going to not have Janine and then you're not going to draw any cards and you're still going to end up passing. So I think it's pretty poor in that regard. Also, if you're using Janine, you're not drawing into your like rare candy combos for this Crobat anyway. So I think it's not actually that synergistic with the supporter that you want to play, so I don't think we're going to be building decks around this. The Toxic Fangs does 120, your opponent's active is now poisoned and put 2 between turns. Yeah, it's good to deal with other single prize Pokemon, that's about as far as it goes unless you go really crazy with Poison synergy. Like I said, there's just no synergy between Janine and getting a stage 2 into play, so I don't think it'll see that much play, even though the ability itself is quite powerful, and I think it's perfect for Cube. We have a Phantom Jack Zoroark. For 2 colors, we deal 60 for each of your opponent's EX and V Pokemon in play. The main archetypes I can see this being a problem for is like Future Box and possibly Raging Bolt Ogerpon. Outside of that, I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal, but if you need to have a single prize Pokemon that can swing the trade against these multi-prize matchups, Zoroark could be pretty decent for that. We have an Yveltal, which has the Gnawing Wings attack for 1 dark. You put 2 counters on each of your opponent's Pokemon that already has damage counters on it. Could be decent with Frostlass Monkey Dory, that sort of deck. You're already playing Darkness Energy, of course, within that list. Could be a really solid Pokemon just to speed up your win condition before you get into the Blood Moon range of the deck. We then have the Okidogi EX. I've already mentioned this, but it is a 250 hit point dark basic, which is really big actually. It's Poison Muscle for 1 color, so allows you to search the deck for 2 basic dark and attach them to this Pokemon, then shuffle your deck afterwards. If you did, you're now poisoned. You're still pretty bulky after you go down to 240 hit points, so it's not an attack that you won't ever use, so it's a cool thing to bear in mind. If you just happen to be bricking, you can at least get that Poison Muscle underway, and it also synergizes with its second attack, the Crazy Chain, for 2 dark and 1 colorless. You deal 130, and if this Pokemon's poisoned, you deal an additional 130 damage. So the 260 baseline is very good for getting through other like basic EXs and even things like Golden Go, I suppose, but we're going to try and push this, of course, with the likes of Binding Mochi, so that we can get up to 300, which is a much better damage output. It now means we're even going to get through ancient boosted basic Pokemon like Raging Bolt and like Roaring Moon. We are, however, still a little bit shy on those stage 2 EXs. Obviously, we already knock out Gardevoir for weakness, so that's not a huge issue, but the concern becomes the likes of Dragapult and Charizard, which I still think we fall a little bit short of. Like I said, comparing this to Roaring Moon EX, it's actually not that impressive of a card because you already have Dark Patch and Janine, but we could be doing Dark Patch and Sada, which generally is going to be the stronger effect. The upside of Okidogi, of course, is that you're not completely bugging yourself down to low hit points, and you're not being blocked by potential mist energy, but overall I do actually think that trade-off isn't that favourable. We then have Monkey Dory EX. It's a dark type with 210 hit points and 1 retreat cost. Its ability is Skip a Beat. If this Pokemon is knocked out by damage from an attack from your opponent's Pokemon, if you have Pecharunt EX in play, your opponent takes 1 fewer prize card, and then its attack is Dirty Headbutt for 2 dark and 1 colourless. Again, I'm instantly just going to compare this to like Roaring Moon, which we have already in format. There is a really good single prize Roaring Moon, which can deal around that 190 threshold pretty quickly, and Monkey Dory EX also hinges on the fact that it's getting knocked out by damage as well, which your opponent might be able to manipulate with the likes of their own basic Monkey Dory, which is terrifying. And the attack cost of Dirty Headbutt is so high, even when we are playing Dark Patch and Janine, it's a really big investment to try and get this as like an effective 1 prize Pokemon for just a 2-shot attack. Doesn't seem that worth it to me. Serendipity EX feels like an awesome card. Its ability is Take Advantage. Once during a turn, if any of your Pokemon were knocked out, during your opponent's last turn, you may draw 3, and you can't use more than 1 ability each turn. This is just that spiritual reprint of the Oricorio GX, which was a very heavily played card. It's a great thing that you can just sit on board and give yourself some Iono protection, especially strong in single prize attacking decks where you can just sort of weave this in towards the late game and push you over the line. We also have a number of aggressive basic multi-prize decks already in the format that use the likes of Mew EX, and I think things like Raging Bolt and even Miraidon could look to have Pheasantipity in addition to Mew EX and the likes of Radiant Greninja in their deck list to give themselves that great safeguard. Its attack also costs 3 colorless, which just adds to its versatility and flexibility, where you can simply deal 100 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon. It's again not all that efficient, but the fact that it's a colorless attacker means it could be used at different points in games. Straight away I'm looking at some of these aggressive basic archetypes and even looking at things like Goldengo EX to have this extra burst amount of draw on board. And sure, if you really want to and play with the whole theme, you can have all of the Pokemon together in this one dark deck. Next up we have Pecharunt EX. It's a basic with 190 hit points, dark type with 1 retreat. Its ability is Controlling Chains. Once during a turn you may switch one of your benched dark Pokemon except Pecharunt with your active. If you do, your new active is now poisoned. This is a very, very powerful effect. As we know, poison is actually an upside if we are going to be incorporating the Biding Mochi. The main concept that they're trying to feed us in the set is that it combines with Okidogi EX, but as I've already mentioned, I think Okidogi is a bait, and the biggest upside is going to be alongside things like Charizard, where we now have a basic Pokemon that can really help us out against Block Snorlax and other controlling strategies. It can also go quite well with Roaring Moon. Ironically, if you have Ancient boosters in the deck, you actually don't worry about the poison, and it's just going to be an easy switch card within your deck. But even if we don't play those tools, we're naturally trying to send our moon into the fire anyway, so it doesn't matter too much for us. The other reason I like Petrarunt is that its attack, Irritating Burst, does 60 damage for each prize card your opponent has taken. So it's a pretty efficient 240 damage, similar to Blood Moon Ursaluna if their opponent is down to 2 prize cards remaining, and this can reach all the way up to 300 for 2 energy if your opponent has gone down to 1 prize card remaining. Again, with the efficiency of these Dark Pokemon, especially with Dark Patch, this feels like a really good late game sweeper. Next up we have Genesect. It's a 110 hit point basic metal type with 1 retreat cost, and its ability is Ace Canceller. As long as this Pokemon has a tool attached to it, your opponent can't play Ace specs from their hand. This actually gives aggressive archetypes a way to play around Unfair Stamp, which is pretty interesting. It forces at least Vacuum alongside the Stamp, which is kind of a big combo for some of these archetypes. It can also block things like Prime Catcher from these Sada decks, which really rely on that supporter card, so can't often play Boss's Orders, making the opponent sometimes have to go through single prizes, which could be a big deal. It could even prevent the Neo Upper Energy from the Dragapult Pidgeot builds, which sounds actually pretty valuable. The difficulty with Genesect is that you have to have done enough with your turn whilst also being able to search Genesect and commit a tool card to it, as well as obviously losing a bench space. So this is a lot that you have to sort of do in your checklist whilst you're also doing your usual setup. So typically it doesn't really come onto the board that early, which always gives the opponent that chance to have used their A-spec that little bit before you, and then these become dead cards in your deck. And as I just mentioned, it may take an extra few steps for them to get the Lost Vacuum or whatever, but they can still just do that, or simply knock out Genesect, and then they still have access to their A-Spec once again. In the old era of A-Specs, we did actually have a Spiritomb card, which was a 2-sided effect of this, and it did see a decent amount of play. But the fact that we are having to attach this tool to actually make Genesect function is the thing that's really putting me off. Combined with the fact that our A-Specs are so searchable now, either via Pidgeot or via Arven, that it's very likely that opponents can use this on turn 2, and not all that likely that you can get a tool attached to your Genesect before they get their usage. We also gain a 70 hit point 1 retreat cost Varoom, which might be relevant for the Revavroom archetype if we're thinking about that. And then we come to some interesting dragon types. We do have a Fracture, which can stop your opponent from affecting this card via support and item cards, but I think we're very rarely actually evolving into a Stage 2 Haxorus. I think this is actually most important as just a Regidrago V-Star option, where you discard this card, and then you can gain access to its 2 attacks, the first of which is Axe Down for 1 fighting, and if your opponent's active Pokemon has any special energy attached, it's immediately locked out. This can be pretty good into Lugia, although they do have Mist Energy, so bear that in mind. And it could be pretty good into Neo Upper Energy Dragapult EX, where typically a Regidrago would have to lose a ton of energy cards to a Raging Bolt attack to otherwise get a KO. And the second attack is just Dragon Pulse for fighting Metal. You deal 230 and discard the top 3 cards of your deck. Not something you want to spam all the time, but actually giving a Regidrago like just another option that can KO stuff means that as you're discarding with Research and with your V-Star power, you just naturally get that Haxorus that little bit more often, so even if you're missing out on a Raging Bolt, you can still deal a decent enough damage to get through some basic EXs. So even though we are sort of spending a space to fit the Haxorus in our deck list, it could be relevant for the Regidrago deck. And then finally the Kyurem. Turns out creatures know exactly what they're doing because Lost Zone Box just won the NAIC, so this is actually the perfect time to be printing this card. Very similar to last season where Spiritomb was coming out just before Mew won the World Championships. I wonder if people will actually tech for Lost Box this time around. We'll see. But Kyurem is a basic dragon type with 130 hit points, and it has the 2 retreat cost. Its ability is Anti-Plasma. If your opponent has a card with Colress in its name in their discard pile, the attack cost of this Pokemon's Trifrost is not the 2 water, 2 metal, 1 colorless. It's instead just 1 colorless, which makes it an extremely splashable option. Trifrost discards all energy attached to this Pokemon. This attack then does 110 to 3 of your opponent's Pokemon. So it's pretty much here for that ability combination to try and be an anti-Lost Box card. 110 damage is a really good threshold. It's dealing with Comfey, Sableye, like Cram and even setting up some of their multi-prize Pokemon at the same time. So obviously, if you get this full effect off, it's going to be huge. What I will say is, obviously, Lost Zone box players can simply put Manaphy in their deck list, and then this Kyurem is still not all that threatening, but it does end up spending a bench space for the Lost Zone players, which can sometimes be a headache. And it also puts them in that strange position of whenever Manaphy is targeted, they immediately have to spend their Super Odds and then spend their Ball Switch cards to get Manaphy into play. And Nest Ball is already like one of the most premium cards in Lost Zone box because they have such little search for their higher hit point Pokemon that they want to gate onto. But creating that sort of starvation for resources is kind of an interesting dynamic to have. The other option, of course, being that if you play Cancelling Clone and bring up Manaphy and use Kyurem at the right time, you can devastate these Lost Zone box players in one turn. The other thing to bear in mind is that this is also possibly a Regidrago V-Star card, where you will, instead of having to pay the 5 energy attack cost, you're now paying 2 grass and a fire. Still pretty pricey, but if you are able to get the 3 snipe of 110 damage, that's still a huge swing. The Regidrago deck is probably playing Dragapult as well, so if you are going to be putting damage counters across certain things, the 110 could be a final sweep to take multiple prizes all in one go. The way Regidrago V-Star is built, it's unlikely that you can get the Cancelling Clone combo off at the right time, but it's not impossible, especially when you have that V-Star power that can pick it out of the discard pile for the right time. When I first saw this card printed, I thought it was never going to see the light of day. I thought Lost Zone box heading into the World Championships was going to be like a 6% archetype, but we've just seen from Hedrick that it's definitely an archetype worth respecting, so it's not unfathomable to see this card as a potential inclusion for Lost Box, and they are going to have to keep this card in mind when they're deck building for Worlds. So it's likely that Lost Zone boxes are going to take that better safe than sorry approach and just have Manaphy in the deck, which gives them random upside into like the mirror match, sometimes into Chempao anyway, and just say that, hey, I'm at least safeguarded around random Kyurems. And I do think that ultimately not many archetypes can afford to fit both Kyurem and a Cologne in their deck, unless Cologne's already featuring for other reasons. So ultimately I still think this is going to be fairly niche of a pick within lists. And one final note, the new Kyurem also does sort of ruin the Chorus's tenacity as well, which is kind of an interesting supporter card, but also means that if you are going to play this in lists, you still need to be playing that Manaphy as well, otherwise you can get randomly crumbed by the person who is teching for Lost Zone box, which I think is kind of interesting. So yeah, that's kind of my quick rundown of the set. I think the most interesting card's actually Revavroom, even though its stats aren't incredible, I think its type coverage makes it relevant, and the fact that it's a very cheap attacker means you can spend other attachments on like Monkey Dories perhaps, or just spend other attachments on other attackers to have more type coverages, or just one prize attacking threats, that sort of thing. I think this is actually low-key being slept on a little bit that I've seen so far. It's cool to have Slitherwing for the ancient decks, that's kind of cool. I think Okidogi is basically a trap, but I think Petulant and Pheasantipede are both really strong cards. And yeah, Kyurem's an interesting tech card to think about. The stadium is also pretty cool for Great Tusk, so I'm actually low-key scared of that. And I still am going to be working on the right ways to build around Binding Mochi. This tool is very, very powerful, and it's just having that consideration of what decks it's worthwhile in to ramp that damage output that little bit further. These are things I need to sort of figure out as well. Let me know your thoughts on the set down below. How impactful do you think this set will be for the World Championships? Is there anything that I missed? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.